Welcome to SHOWstudio. It's a very exciting day because it's our first panel of the season. So begins a mammoth fashion month. But it's a really exciting one to start with, and it's quite a unique one to start with because Gareth Pugh is showing in New York, which is obviously a big change everyone's really excited about. He's also showing in a very different way, adding to the theme of change. He's not doing a traditional catwalk presentation. He's done something much more immersive, and he's a big sort of performance meets fashion film display, which is really, really exciting. And before we have a look at the event, I'll just let my amazing set of panellists from all across the industry introduce themselves, starting with you, Stavros.
Hi, I'm Stavros Karelis, and I'm the founder and buying director of Machine A Store.
Hello, I'm Caryn Franklin. I'm fashion commentator and agent of change.
And I'm Soki, and I'm a freelance fashion stylist and creative director.
Hello, I'm Hywel Davies, fashion writer and course leader of fashion communication at Central St Martin's.
I want to start with a simple question, which is just about Gareth and why we all love Gareth, and also what we think Gareth has done for fashion, because I feel like change is something you always associate with Gareth. You know, he's always one pushing things forward. What makes him such a special designer? I'll throw that out there. Anyone feeling brave can answer.
Well, I think it's exactly what you said. It's about trying to push boundaries, and you know, I think with his move to New York, it's like a high-profile change, like you said, and it's about him questioning what we think about what fashion is, and whether it's about performance or wearability, or you know, he's got such a strong sensibility. It's a very clear aesthetic. It's so easy to understand. Not necessarily to understand, it's so easy to identify what his approach is to fashion. And I think he's one of those key designers that really defines the sort of London approach to design.
You're nodding, Stavros. Do you agree?
No, yeah. For me, actually, you know, like this is one of the most exciting things with Gareth is that he's one of the first students and fashion designers that came out from London. That they originally belonged to the set of East London, and you know, he went through Fashion East, and then he won like the New Gen sponsorships. And it's great, like, to see like how he's been developed to become who he is today, and you know, moving from London to Paris, and then from Paris to New York, keeping this signature style that he's got, and also, you know, showing to a worldwide audience right now that what London is about, which is the excitement, you know, doing things with a very specific way and keeping his signature style.
So do you think that he is quite a kind of champion for London? It's not, with Gareth, it's always more than just about being a him, it's about that kind of London style, which I think he really has come to symbolise in some ways. Like maybe it's the club kid connotation, which I think people get tired of. I think they're like, oh no, London isn't just about crazy club kids, but it's definitely a part of our fashion heritage, which I think is important. What do you think about Gareth, Caryn?
I will never get tired of seeing somebody with attitude. And I think Gareth is someone who has made no secret of drawing upon the kind of early 80s roots that were as much about attitude as they were about aesthetic. And that's one of the things with him, really. He combines an energy which is thrilling. And when you can sit in front of a fashion show year after year and be truly thrilled, that's a very special magic. And I think when you combine that with his kind of personal energy, which is so down to earth, so approachable, so warm, and his sense of fun.
He's very funny.
I remember sitting in one of the shows, and it was sort of gothic and scary, spooky, you know, kind of fashion noir. Spiky, and then at the end he plays this kind of tinkly little clothes show theme tune from the 80s, and everybody's going, what? And that's his specialness, is he just pulls in, and the attitude that he does it with is pure London.
Do you think that's why young people love him so much still? Because there's this idea of like, youth and vitality and Londonness.
I think people look so much into where inspiration comes from and where, like, what is the reason behind this. And I read that last season it was all on intuition, so he just kind of decided to roll with it and see what happened. And I feel like when you look at his past collections, you sort of feel like it's all about mood. So you would expect, if you don't know him, that it would be, maybe that's how he's feeling, or that's, you know, and then it's kind of evolving from that when the collections got a bit lighter and a bit, you know, less, as you said, less gothic and dark. And then now we're looking at something that's so different from last season, and it's less about the clothing, it's more about movement. So it's kind of, I think what young people like about it is it's not predictable. It's just something that I think that's what it is. You can't predict what he's going to do, and that's exciting for especially people coming from London. It's like a bit of hope, a bit of chance that they can do the same.
It's interesting when you mentioned there the performance, which we will have look at in a minute, because I'd like to talk about that, this idea of the best way to present fashion, because Gareth has spoken after this show. He gave a couple of quotes to journalists where he said, you know, I'm not saying that catwalk shows are dead at all. I'm not saying that I'm not going to do another catwalk show. It's just I like to sort of try different ways of showing things and open up that field. Do you think it's important that we do kind of question the fashion show as a way of presenting clothes? Caryn, you look very excited.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, I think, you know, film isn't, you know, it's not a new idea. John Maybury did something with Three Fat Osbet, you know, a long, long time ago, and everybody panicked. Was fashion going to disappear into film? And, you know, how could everybody get together and network, which is very, very important, that kind of energy of everybody pulling together. But I think there being this kind of rigid approach where the catwalk becomes a gallery space and ultimately loses contact with the end user. Doesn't necessarily benefit the industry, and that may be a space for us to kind of bring in some flexibility. Doesn't mean everybody's going to do installations. You know, the catwalk is a lovely energy, but maybe there's lots of different ways to do it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say that as well, because I think people often talk about the scheduling of fashion and how it's gone a bit mad, you know, things are in the store 6 months after, and I wonder if this kind of freedom of people being able to show a bit more on their own terms would kind of help benefit a way of us kind of finding a fix to coats in summer and bikinis in winter. You know, it's quite interesting. What's your take on it, Hal?
Well, no, I think, you know, what Caryn said, I think it's interesting that there are people being given opportunities to do things in different ways. But I think maybe what's more, you know, because I think film's been around for quite a long time, and obviously with SHOWstudio, we're very aware of how film has a massive impact on how fashion's communicated. But I think what's really interesting, it's not, you know, what Gareth, I haven't seen this yet, but what Gareth is doing, it's about the combination of film, but it's also still the live experience, and I think that's what's really interesting. The idea that whatever we're going to see can be used digitally, and lots of people can see it wherever they are. But I'm sure to actually be there is going to be an experience in itself, and I think that's the most exciting thing that's kind of happening in communication. It's the idea of something that's happening. It's a one-off event. It's kind of like the fashion show was, but it's also using, you know, digital technology to enhance that and being able to transport that internationally as well. So I think there's lots of other sort of different levels that's happening. It's not just about film.
Yeah, that's interesting, this combination of something that's brilliant for the people who were there, but a second angle where you can also communicate that. Because you sometimes think that when you see videos of catwalk shows, where they just don't show the clothes that well, and you think if there was a better way of combining that kind of being there experience and that exclusivity with something that can then be shared to people. It's an interesting one. What do you think about it, Stavros? It's funny because you come from a buying perspective, so you see the shows quite differently.
I mean, in general, in terms with Gareth, because in terms of Gareth, well, you know, like with brands like someone like Gareth, for example, you know, like he's sometimes like it depends on the clothes and depends on like the season as well. You know, like with the clothes, some clothes really look good on film because they need like this movement, they need like a specific lighting. So that plays like a really big part. You know, some things, something like that you might miss on a catwalk show. From the other side, you know, in terms of the buyer's point of view, if I speak about that, you know, it's important to see the actual clothes on a catwalk, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you can see them later on in the showroom. You know, so you can experience that. But yeah, I think that someone like Gareth, for example, you know, it's very important to use the film because you can see the whole mood and aesthetic and also the movement of the clothes and the materials, because he's using like so specific materials lots of times in his collections, and it was something that he used like since the beginning of his brand. I mean, the film and also kind of like the performance element is not, I think, something new to Gareth.
No,
I mean, he always did that season after season, and I think that now that he's going to he's showing in New York for the first time, I think he wants like really to push this element forward and show that this is Gareth Pugh, that this is something very original to his brand. It's not something that he picked up along the way, or someone went there, he told him this season let's do it that way?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's not a gimmick with him, you know. Like we were all talking before we went live about the amazing films he's done with Ruth Ogburn throughout his career. The films today weren't actually made by Ruth Ogburn, but it's interesting that you say this is almost. We talked about that he has a very definitive identity, and actually, if you think about it, performance and film is very much a part of that. You know, he has collaborated before on things like ballets. The Wonderful Carbon Life that he did was amazing. So it feels very in keeping to see sort of dance and performance. Before we have a look, I also want to pick up on this idea of city hopping, because I think that's really interesting, and it's something I think everyone in fashion is quite guilty of talking about a London aesthetic, a Paris aesthetic, a New York. Like we do it here, we do our London roundup, we do our New York roundup, we do our Paris roundup, and you do tend to kind of sometimes I think shoehorn an individual designer's aesthetic into a kind of city aesthetic. Do you think it's quite important to see designers kind of move around a bit and change that up, or is that just confused? What's our take on it?
I think it's really, really important, and I think it's important from a designer's point of view in terms of their business, because you see people like McQueen did it. He went to New York and did a show, and I think it is actually interesting to think about what Gareth's doing in the context of he is doing it in New York, which we don't necessarily always think about as being the most exciting or creative, fashion week. So I think it is really good for designers to move, and obviously Gareth was in Paris for several years. And I just think it exposes the designers to different audiences, which is really important, because ultimately they're there to get more business.
I completely agree with you. Yeah,
not everyone travels to everything. So
I completely agree with you. It's very, very important, because they also, obviously most of the buyers are traveling between London and Paris and New York and Milan, but it's the business side of things is very, very different in different countries. So they have. They make the collection of the brand accessible to a completely different market, which probably he's targeted right now. And I think that Gareth is a great fit for New York. I think it's a very, very wise move to move his brand there.
It's also it's interesting because he does have this kind of point of difference in New York. It's interesting what you said, Hywel, about it's not perhaps the city that is known for kind of raw creativity in the way that London is, and it's quite interesting. I think sometimes designers get analysed in a way that I think people often think of Rodati as the very kind of creative ones. And I think it's partly because they sit alongside designers that aren't so. And if they show in London, you wonder if they showed in Paris, the different contexts with which you'd see their work. And I think it's quite refreshing. You imagine with a lot of the designers who we analyse, a change of city would actually perhaps change how they're seen against their peers, because that's naturally how you assess a designer against what else is on show. What's your take on it, Caryn?
I think there's a framing of the brand, isn't there? And if you are operating out of a space in which, for instance, London, home to an energy like Gareth Pugh, you're not necessarily having that kind of diverse experience from buyers and from people who haven't seen your work. So, it's an important thing, I think, to challenge your own idea of yourself and to challenge other people's idea of yourself. And I would just love to have heard some of the commentary from some of the perhaps New York press who are more commercial in their thinking, and it is more hard dollars, and and of course London isn't like that at all, and Paris pursues a kind of noble aesthetic, so everything in pursuit of art is absorbed. But I'd love to have heard some of the comments from those hard New Yorkers.
But is it important as well that we open our minds to this idea of not just having those 4 fashion cities? And I know we're seeing lots of fashion weeks sort of spring up around different countries, but is it more than that? It's not just having fashion weeks in different territories, it's more just having this idea that fashion can take place across the globe, and you can communicate what you've got to make through a film or through a live stream performance. Because we are still really stuck in this mentality of the 4 cities, which is obviously important from a buying perspective. You need some organisation of Fashion Week as a trade show, but I think it's also this idea that you can be anywhere and you don't have to go to Paris to be a designer.
But I think interesting just to say that is mirroring historically what's happened with economic territories. And now we have digital taking over as a sort of economic driving force in which there is no geographical territory. You have a virtual kind of office space, and the village, the world is your buyer. And I think ultimately we'll see that happen with fashion at some point.
In terms of the buying though, obviously the more fashion weeks happening, around the world, the more difficult things
Yeah,
becoming, because obviously it has to do with the seasons, and but when a buyer has a budget to spend on per season, he has to go during like 4 fashion weeks, 5 fashion weeks, see the shows. But when imagine if almost every country was doing like a fashion week, and then your budget would never reach to see even half of this like half of these like fashion weeks, because and then also it has to do with the seasons, and when the clothes are getting delivered in the store, and obviously now has become even more complicated in terms of like pre-collections and so many other things that are going on. I guess it's the same thing with the press, though. It's not just from a buying point of view. I mean, it has to do with the magazines as well, what they communicate.
Sorry.
It's fine. What the magazines are communicating, like, I mean, if it's showcasing an editorial with like all autumn winter, it's going to be really funny to feature as well. Like things that are happening from spring summer collections. So
I think it's an interesting point, because I wonder sometimes whether it would be worth buyers and press being separated out in how they view fashion, because you think for the buyers perhaps it does make sense for them to have their schedule where they work within their budgeting schedule, and they go and they see the showrooms perhaps, and then the press view fashion in a very different way, and they do view it on perhaps less of a sort of forced sense of fashion week. It's interesting. Don't know if that would happen though.
It'd be very odd, because I think when I would do the circuit, I think what's really interesting as a journalist point of view is when you actually do interact with the buyers. You need to know what people are talking about, what people want to buy, and I think it'd be odd to sort of separate that sort of interaction.
You do, but I think ultimately press are under pressure to go for the stories, the brand new stories, and often those are not necessarily aligned to the end user. And so what's happening that's exciting theatre drama is what thrills us, but the end user that the buyer is holding, because if you're not buying with an understanding of who's going to wear it and how they're going to wear it, then you're stuck with the stock.
I completely agree with you. I mean, it's exactly what you both said, is that the one need the other, to be there and interact and exchange opinions, and you need that feeling in a show to see what is the excitement, what people are looking at, because all the stores right now have become about products, so it's not just about a brand, but it's like what is the key item of the season, which is the item that's going to get sold out, and these items normally you're going to be able to understand them when you are in a show, or and you start speaking with the press. All of them, however, somehow and very funny, they commented one product, or like 2 products, and it happened to you, after a show we're talking about, and we're all talking about like one specific product of a designer. All these things are very, very important information, and for the press and for the buyer.
Yeah, that's interesting actually. And it's interesting because you often talk to designers who are very frustrated with the buy that is done of their collection, and they say that they don't feel it represents the collection, and you think that's going to get even more of a problem if buyers are separated from press. That's interesting. Just talking about this digital thing, I'm interested to get your opinion, Soki, but also you, Stavros, about brands that sort of forgo fashion week and they do something like they try and make a name for themselves using a film online, or even using things like Tumblr or Instagram. Like, how often do you guys find a new talent that way? Because we often talk about it as something like, well, it's so easy to be a young designer now, you can promote yourself that way, but I'm interested, does it actually happen? Do you find people that you're inspired by? Is that a way that you look for talent?
Yeah, well, I always mention that I use Showtime, and I'll find designers through them, and Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr, and I mean, I think it's really important, but I also see it from a different point of view. If you're a much more established designer, that necessarily doesn't work. Like, for example, some designers I work with, it's kind of like, lookbook on request, or it just depends on the calibre of the designer, but with the designers that I shoot with, it's all about the aesthetic and the mood behind it, or like giving them a chance to showcase their work. So that's what I work with. So I think that would only, I'm thinking, relate to those kind of designers, but I don't know.
Do you think sometimes it makes more sense for them not to show then at a fashion week sometimes? There are certain designs where you think you're so suited to showing just with an online platform or something.
I think, but I think as a designer, like, that's part of the process. It's like the excitement of being able to have your own show and being able to say you've done it. It's like a little ladder that they've kind of completed. It's like you're not a legit designer until you've had a show. So even when Gareth's got his installation, Gareth's an amazing, incredible designer, but to some people that I've spoken to, their opinion is when I've suggested an installation, because it might necessarily not be as expensive as a show, they don't see it as as important as holding an actual runway show. So
yeah, do you think we need that mentality to change, the idea that a presentation is somehow less valid than a catwalk show? Because you're right, it is less expensive, but also sometimes you can see the clothes better. And
and it gives you a much more, it's an intimate feeling. You get to see them, you get to spend time, you know. Sometimes when the model's walking down a runway, you turn away, you've missed it, and you know, as a stylist, you don't get to see those until press days. But if you're just as a regular watching the show, you won't get to see that for. Well, you get to see it online, but as we said the last time, the images that we see don't showcase the collection at all properly. So,
but I think there's an interesting kind of injection around celebrity culture, where the catwalk show has become a kind of fashion red carpet. And so there's this, you know, the whole flashing camera, whether it's the model of the moment or the front row personality, and there's an urgency built in that people are almost addicted to in fashion, is that, you know, it's now's the moment, I've got to be in front of this moment. And I think that it's a bit kind of high caffeine behaviour in some ways, and what surely would happen at some point, I think, as we become more and more interested in our individual needs, because fashion has a kind of collective promotion of the uniform of the season, but people are becoming more and more confident about saying, well, that doesn't actually suit me, it doesn't work for me, and all of the things that you're showcasing on these bodies do not relate to my body, and I need to find a solution for myself. And I think more and more young designers are working in a way where they can have relationships with individuals, and so there's real empathy in the process. And so the sort of urgency of the red carpet glamour moment is a moment, and it's lovely and it's enjoyable, but it doesn't mean to say that it does the job perfectly.
I think it is still really seductive though, the actual fashion show. We're all seduced, you know, it is a very privileged thing to go to when you go to those amazing shows, and I don't think that's ever going to be lost in fashion. I don't think it should, because I think it does do so much about really define what the industry's about and what a designer's about. So I completely understand how, and I think it is good what you're talking about. There's different levels that designers can now interact with people, so it wasn't just about the fashion show. And I think it is brilliant that, you know, people are looking to use different platforms.
But even I think it's interesting we talk about that kind of magical moment, and I think sometimes fashion people, they're perhaps a bit, they often talk about fashion that can't be translated, and I agree in a way, but then I think it can be. You know, you think the V&A do their amazing like fashion in motion evenings, or things like when I went to, I'm obsessed with this, I talk about it all the time, but when I went to see the ballet that Gareth had done, we'd done the costumes for it, and that was incredible. And you think there's lots of ways actually for designers to invite the public, you know, people who might buy their clothes or even just enjoy their aesthetic, to enjoy that kind of, that seductive theatricality of the catwalk show. And I think that's quite an interesting space that people can perhaps occupy, to try and just think, you know, I love that element of drama and theatre, and there are all these ways that I can take that to a wider audience through collaboration. I think that's really, really interesting. But again, it's the problem of finding time, isn't it, always? Should we have a look at what Gareth did? As we talked about, if we go to the images first, Liam, thank you. So it was an event that was sponsored by Lexus. It's called Design Disrupted. So basically he was kind of foregoing the idea of doing a fashion show, and he was doing this kind of big immersive presentation where he had various different fashion films that were playing at the same time. He had sort of these column screens and a big circle screen, and lots of different dancers kind of performing, which we're going to see here. And as they were dancing, there's an overhead camera which was also projecting the view of the dancing onto the screens. And people who were at the event said that it was quite this idea of being very lucky to see something, almost like you were at a gig, people kind of running to the screens to see things. And he did give some quotes where he said that he wanted it to feel like people were lucky to be there, you know, that idea again of kind of, I think, running into a show, which is probably quite, I know we talked about that kind of 80s club kids thing, about that idea of kind of struggling to see stuff. And the films, it wasn't Ruth Hogben that made the films. I know there's been some confusion about that. It was a filmmaker and artist called Andrew Thomas Hwang, who served as creative director. And as I said before, the choreography of the performance was done by Wayne McGregor. So you can see it is about the clothes, but it also isn't. It's more about the mood and the vibe, which is quite interesting.
I think what this also takes, though, is confidence to have your own opinion about what's going on and what you value in this. And, you know, the fashion industry is traditionally all about pack membership, with everybody all sat watching each other and watching what Susie Menkes is responding to, or that key buyer is responding to. And here you're left alone with your own experience of it. And for some people in the industry who need that membership kind of agreement to think, okay, do we like this? Yes, we all like it. And then off they go and promote it. That might be quite challenging. And that is one of the reasons why I love that approach, Gareth's approach, because he is separating out people who are prepared to have an individual response. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that idea of kind of removing people from the safety of the catwalk environment that they're used to, and I think it's really good. To me, it's very different, but it reminds me in a way of what Raf Simons did for the men's when at his last show. It's similar also in terms of lighting. It's quite lighting, exactly. But you went in and there wasn't seating, and you kind of had to find your own place, and the catwalk was just a taped out mark on the floor, and all of the safety of, as you say, you know, knowing what row you'll usually be in, the people you'll be sat with usually, and being able to kind of watch who's on the front row and what they're doing was completely removed, and everyone was kind of just standing around. And I think there's something quite interesting about trying to sort of almost give people a little shake and jig that up. And I think it's interesting that we've seen that happen now, that Raf did it and now Gareth's doing it. I wonder if that's something that we're going to see more, this idea of removing the kind of predictability of the catwalk show.
I also actually think about when I'm seeing that for example, Rick Owens did it, you know, like he did like this amazing performance, you know, with a Marit, like basically song and stuff, and it was like so cool on the catwalk show. And obviously given the connection of Rick Owens with Gareth, I don't know also how much this could have played some part of it, you know, like that this is a new way of showing things and keeping the momentum, the excitement. But there are lots of brands, like, I mean, because we're talking about New York Fashion Week, for example, you know, Hood by Air is another brand that is doing that, you know, it's doing like this kind of like performance element into the shows.
It's interesting to see it. It's interesting you mentioned Rick and Michelle, because I feel like there is a definite narrative there, and it's interesting. You were talking before about Gareth's freedom. You know, he does a catwalk show. He shows in Paris. He'll show in London. He'll show in New York. And Rick's very similar. He became known as the kind of ringmaster, and then one season he was just like, oh, you know, I don't want to do that anymore. It was too much of a focus on that, so I'll change. And I love that idea of flexibility. I think that's one thing. So many designers are very fearful of changing, and if they become used. If people associate them with a certain way of showing, they're reluctant to change that. What do we think? It's hard, obviously, to see the fashion, but what do we think of the aesthetic that we're seeing? Just because it's interesting how at the start, when you talked about Gareth's really sort of clear identity, because even just those, sorry, can we just go back to that image before with the checks? Because that's something that you so associate with Gareth. Yeah. Do we think that's also a sign of confidence when designers are like can be so clear and have these aesthetic codes that they consistently do?
Can I of course. Question? Are these the clothes that is like of this season, or is the film the film stills are from previous seasons?
These film stills are from this season, aren't they? Yeah, they're from what's predicted on the wall.
So the clothes that were used on the film are like from this season.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, sorry.
No problem. Yeah. Sorry,
But we don't know if he is showing. The films could be showing previous collections, though, could it? I don't know.
I presume they're showing current fashion, but you're right. Actually, maybe they could be showing archive pieces.
I think it was all current fashion.
All current fashion.
Behind was an overhead projection, so you saw from 2 angles.
Oh, cool. Okay.
But I think what we haven't, you know, because you mentioned at the beginning of the press release that it's sponsored by Lexus, and I think that's such an important thing for people to understand. It is a car company that is allowing this to happen, or paying for it. So, you know, I'm sure this sort of production is not a usual fashion presentation. So, you know, I think that's really interesting that a car brand is sponsoring Gareth to come to New York and put on this amazing presentation. So also the benefits that a brand like Lexus is getting from that association.
What benefits do they get from that kind of association? Because we're seeing so much like big technology companies, big car companies.
It's just kudos, it's cool. You know, fashion is so current and everybody wants a bit of it, and it's so, everyone, you know, wants to be part of it. So they're just buying into that, which is kind of interesting.
But I think that's a really kind of crucial point to pick up on, you know, for future survival for fashion, is that, you know, it does hold a position of taste leadership for a huge variety of companies who look at the built-in disposability in a marketplace where people readily accept that something will last them for only a short period of time, even though its usage could go on. And certainly Apple have gone, oh, that's where we need to be.
Yeah, that's really
We've got to have all kinds of fashion associations with our
fashion
product.
people.
Yeah. And anybody, any visionary large brand who is thinking about how they need to replace themselves would be surely considering what fashion can do for them, and also what they can do for fashion, and that's like a perfect alliance, isn't it?
Because when I googled this, to see, there was a lot of press about it, in general press, and more press than when Gareth went to Paris. For sure, because it's got that huge brand behind it, that huge marketing budget to promote it.
Let's talk about what we're seeing here, because this is absolutely incredible. So as I said, you've got these dancers who are performing, and then as Liam said, they've got an overhead camera that's projecting onto a back screen. And this bit was absolutely fantastic, where you see this kind of elevation of the model, and she's wearing just absolutely sort of incredible, very Gareth, there's almost a sense of it being quite destroyed, but also incredibly opulently beautiful. And she kind of rose up, so this big moment of fashion theatre, which I think is quite fantastic.
It's kind of an operatic grandeur, isn't there? It's just delicious.
It's really
and sometimes I think it's easy, when you're not having to make something like that happen, to just sit back and let it wash over you, because we're so used to seeing these amazing special effects now. It's just part of everyday kind of visual aesthetic, that when you start to deconstruct the amount of work and thought that's gone into that for a kind of 10-15 minute production, it's quite spectacular.
It's interesting when you said the amount. Sorry.
Oh no. Yeah, I'm just agreeing that this must have been like way more difficult than producing a catwalk show. You know, I mean, like the amount of work that has gone into something like that to look that good must have been 10 times more difficult than producing a catwalk show.
Yeah, it's great. Because there are like 3 different films, 2 dance performances all going on at the same time, and to bring it together is one thing. Just some notes on the collection and the films itself. He's talked about it being inspired by rituals and rites and sort of folklore, and this interplay between sort of control and chaos, which is also quite interesting, because you mentioned that kind of operatic grandeur, but then there's also the kind of chaos aspect of it all, where there is this real sort of regal moment, but then also the moment when the dancers are all moving. It's quite quite chaotic, which I kind of love with Gareth, because I do think there's that contrast with him. Can we have a look at the films? Is that possible? It's going to give us a bit of a snapshot.
Do we know if the audience were sat in like a theatre?
They weren't sat at all.
They just came in and walked around?
Came in, they were kind of ushered into different areas, and then people apparently were kind of, you can see everyone with the mobiles, everyone was kind of running, trying to capture it on the...
So they were interacting and stuff,
Yeah, which I think is quite interesting to kind of make people fight to see. Because people are used to, I think they think that they're in control at a show and a fashion is presented to them, whereas this is kind of, you have to come to the fashion, which I think is quite interesting.
It's also maybe picking up on that whole energy where everybody is making their own experience, because it's been, there's a festival kind of atmosphere, and that's the one thing that Catwalk doesn't offer, is that kind of loosey-goosey, I'm interacting festival space. It's very stern, it's very strict, and people sit there obediently waiting for it to start, and there's a set beginning and end. And here, I would imagine that people are having much more of an emotional response.
And it takes away the hierarchy, which is really exciting.
It's really exciting.
Whoever wants to be at the front can be at the front.
And it's this, I think it's really interesting what you both just implied there, this idea of creating your own experience, which is something a fashion show, I think, is intended to give everyone a uniform experience.
Yes,
even now, like think the way press releases are written, you go and you all leave knowing exactly what the collection was about, and you all you're taught to have the same response to it. Whereas this, you think, depending on where you were standing, depending on who you were standing with, depending whether you were at the front, you'd have a totally different view of it. Maybe you didn't see something because you couldn't get to the front in time, and I kind of love that haphazard nature.
Yeah.
Have we got any sound? Because it'd be
is there sound on the videos? It's alright, don't worry.
I mean, that's incredible. That is a... who was producing this? Because
it was creative directed by by Andrew Thomas Hine, the filmmaker who I mentioned. I don't know who was doing the production.
Because there's an enormous amount to, you know,
I
to
imagine
choreograph.
having Wayne McGregor doing the choreography would have been pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And these amazing kind of crystal face coverings which you're seeing, these brilliant bodices, which I think is really... Can we see that one again? Because that was amazing.
That's really cool.
Well, I mean, what I love about this is it takes you a lot further in terms of experience than the Catwalk show, because you come out with a lot more to ask around the process. Whereas, you know, your point about, or maybe the point about uniform experience, you know, fashion to a certain extent has been homogenized to a kind of the uniform for the season. And magazines no longer have the freedom to write in the way that they used to write about fashion, because they're too busy supporting advertisers. So there's a uniform statement, and that's got to change. And this allows definitely for a shake-up, doesn't it?
But what's interesting, like what you said before, you know, is this really about the presentation and not so much about the clothes? Because obviously, from a buying perspective, it's very different to think, you know, we all love it in terms of a visual story, but are we actually looking at clothes or just an image?
But you know, it reminds me also, you know, like the Diesel show with the recent Diesel show under Nicolas from JD creative direction that Nick Knight and SHOWstudio produced like all the films, and it was like everything like that was happening, and actually it was like this kind of like interaction, but because you could see like all these amazing visuals on the back that were supporting the Catwalk show, and then in the middle of the Catwalk show there were like performances, and also again, you know, like there all the people didn't have sitting, so you know, like you could sit anywhere you wanted with your friends, hang out, talking about the show and everything. I'm guessing that it has to do with like every designer and every brand separately, and what is the moment, what is maybe with what Gareth is doing here, he wants like to kind of like to show a new era of his brand, you know, that he's accessing a new market, so he wants like to show the feeling of his brand and what Gareth Pugh is about. So that's why you see perhaps like so many heavy references in the films of his previous collections, you know, previous work. So it's a new market, and you know, as much as people do know about Gareth in USA, it's a really good platform right now to show an overall aesthetic of who Gareth Pugh is, because that helps a lot. To his future shows, because I'm guessing that perhaps his next show is going to be just a pure Catwalk show, that, you know, people already have this in mind, so in 6 months time they're going to get what Gareth Pugh show is about when they see only one Catwalk show. Yeah, it's really interesting when you talk about that longevity, because it's interesting as well what you said, how about, you know, it doesn't really feel like it's about the clothes, and I question, you know, does that matter in some ways? You think I kind of admire that rejection of the seasonality of fashion, you know, like, but why do I have to do something every 6 months that is showing new clothes? Why can't I do something that consolidates my aesthetic, or because I think there is something that's breaking away from that sort of relentlessness of fashion by saying, you know, I'm going to do something that is about my overall vision. There's an interesting element to that, because we all know you go to the showroom and you see lots of commercial pieces, so you never see on the catwalk.
Which you never see on the catwalk anyway, even if it's a really boring catwalk. So there's an interesting thing to that.
But it'll also be interesting to think about whether he'll show in New York next season or go back to Paris, because there's so many designers that go to New York and do one season as like an impact thing and then go back. So
I do wonder if this is a kind of special one-off thing because of Lexus. And is there a sadness though too, and this is me maybe playing devil's advocate, but are we sad that it's getting so much press and so much attention because Lexus are kind of really pushing it? And it's interesting when you mentioned, you know, that Gareth perhaps didn't get so much press when he moved to Paris the first time. Is there like a sadness that that's what it takes for, you kind of mentioned this, Caryn, this idea of fashion writers, they write about what the advertisers tell them they have to write about, and Lexus is kind of telling everyone to write about this, so everyone's going to write about it. And I'm not saying people don't want to engage with Gareth's work, but is it upsetting that it takes a big car brand to get everyone to take notice of something?
Not for me.
It's not sad. I think, you know, it's better that Lexus support this and we see it than it not happen at all. So, you know, I think.
And actually, what they have done clearly is said, here's the money, what are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
That surely is the
Great.
best outcome.
Yeah.
You know, because in the old days, when you would have, you know, a sponsor or a backer, people put some money into you, they would have very distinct ideas about where you had to then begin to appeal, you know, market-wise. If you weren't doing enough glitz because you weren't going to meet the Middle East, you know, you had to get some crystal in because that was going to be a big market, and they wanted to see their money. And clearly this is, you know, money that doesn't come with all kinds of strings attached.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because you think often when you get these kind of big events, it's because a store perhaps is doing something with a designer, and then you really see that they've been kind of shoehorned into doing lots of different things. But this is that sense of, here's the money, go do what you want with it.
Yeah.
What's your take on it, Soki? Have you enjoyed having a look
Yeah,
at
I
it?
enjoyed
You look really
it.
impressed by it.
No, what I'm intrigued about is that when you do an installation like this, obviously what the write-ups that when I've googled it, is that you'd have to really be there to experience the full extent of how amazing it is. So when you obviously watch a fashion show, within half an hour the images are up on style.com or vogue.com, so everyone all over the world get to see that straight away. Even if it's not to the quality of the catwalk, you still get to see that. But the images that we've seen, I don't think they're amazing, but obviously don't do the actual presentation justice. So when we go back to mentioning, you know, taking in Fashion Week into different cities, I see it as a naive point of view, not as a buyer, but as in it is an experience, and you're giving different, I mean, not the whole city is going to be able to see the show, but it's giving different people a chance to experience this like amazing thing. So I think it is amazing, because I'm kind of thinking, as you're talking, I'm thinking, oh, is that a risk? Is it?
Yeah.
Because like as we were looking through, there isn't much, like he got a lot of press, but there isn't much content to see, even though it was last night.
I wonder if they'll share the actual films later.
Yeah, when people are explaining, you know, the beams and how people are scrambling, you can begin to picture it, but you can't imagine exactly what it was.
It's interesting, that notion of good imagery, because I remember when Rick Owens did the collection with all the step dances, and the catwalk imagery obviously was girls dancing, and it was really amazing imagery, because you got them kind of their facial expressions and their movement.
Yeah.
But I did notice, you know, when you get your catwalk guides and your trend guides, a lot of that imagery hadn't been used because it just didn't stand alongside the picture of a woman walking. And I think it's interesting that the kind of just how fashion has become so used to being able to present fashion as a flat catwalk image now, and anything that doesn't fit with that is it does limit you in some ways.
And obviously Gareth is the calibre of designer I was mentioning before, that you don't need the Tumblr and the you know, social media. It is what it is. And I sat down a few times with a couple of emerging designers and their PR. It's funny what they decide they need is content online to give to print, and it's so much more complex than what I thought a designer would do. It would be just to have an idea and go with it, and it's all about up here instead of making money and you know, what magazines need this and for what, you know what I mean? It's just, I think in it from a different point of view.
It's so sad, isn't it, when designers are having to think not just like designers but also like content pushers.
Yeah.
You know, like it's quite scary. I kind of love this idea with this, because I wonder if I feel like sometimes when people are served up fashion imagery and they're like, oh, this is the imagery of like the Carvin show or the Chloe show or whatever, and they look at it and they're like, oh right, and they move on. But I'm interested maybe if people saw this online, and it would make them actually like, oh, I can't really see what's going on, and maybe want to know more, and then actually do some research, which is quite interesting.
But that might be the whole reason, and I'm sure, you know, if Lexus is going to Gareth and gives like all this amount of money, you know, for that kind of production, which is a really, really well thought, amazingly beautifully done production and show, I'm sure they have a really big strategy about how they're going to promote this whole thing, like to people afterwards. I mean, right now, only like it's been since yesterday evening that the show was, but people are already talking about it. So you know what this video is about, or what the performance is about.
That's so
maybe that is a part of the whole communication strategy that, you know, they're going definitely. I'm 100% sure that putting all this money and effort to producing something so beautifully,
forgotten the next
they haven't forgotten the next step. They're going to promote it with a very, very right way. And in terms of like probably a buyer's point of view, or like, and from the press point of view that they want to see the actual clothes, I'm sure perhaps they have like showed a lookbook before or after this performance that they're going probably to send together with like the films or however they're going to promote it.
And it's interesting to take their time with that, because you think there's such a sense of instantness to a catwalk show. You know, you see it, you see the images straight away, as you were saying, Soki, you know, you get them within 30 minutes all over Instagram, and then it's kind of done and forgotten. And it's almost, there's a real sadness to that kind of disposability of the catwalk show, not just the garments. And with this, you do wonder if it gives it a bit more longevity. Maybe we'll see the films released online over the next kind of weeks, and it keeps that as a moment rather than just this kind of like catwalk show that happened and finished and it was reviewed, written up, done, no one's going to talk about it again. I quite like this idea of this being something that could be, you know, maybe these performances will be staged again somewhere else. There's something quite interesting about the longevity.
It could be the same thing with, it happened the same thing with Rick Owens, you know, with that show, with the step dancers, you know, everyone was talking about it, and then obviously afterwards, you know, they release it, they show what the whole thing is about. But also I think it's communicating that part with everyone that is interested in the brand, but also keeping a moment of the people that they could access that place right there and then. Some brands like to do this, you know, they give like something special to people that they can only be there, and I'm referring to someone like Ralph, for example, you know, when he did the show, the one we're talking about with all the lighting, I think that was a thing that they did, not for kind of like the public, but the people that they were in there to kind of like get into that vibe. For whatever reasons they won't like to do that.
But if you think there's nothing more kind of luxurious or seductive than exclusivity, is there? And I think, you know, that's, people often talk about the democratization of high fashion, and I do wonder if, you know, you see it with people like Tom Ford and even, you know, Phoebe Philo with how she runs sort of the digital side of Celine. There is this sense of holding back that I think is becoming quite fashionable. I even find it quite interesting with younger brands like someone like Mead & Kirchhoff, who are a very popular online brand. You know, you always see their imagery shared on Tumblr and Instagram, but then they don't have a Twitter themselves, they don't really promote themselves. It's quite interesting, this idea of pulling back. I wonder how, because you work with a lot of, obviously with all your amazing students at St Martin's, have you noticed that with some of them, this kind of rejection of thinking that they have to be all online?
Yeah, I think because, you know, with digital platforms, there's so many ways that you can put yourself out there and put your work out there. And I was really surprised with my students, some who are sitting here.
Hi, Gareth.
I can expect everyone to have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you know, everyone will be blogging, especially with our new journalism course. But like a lot of students don't have their own blog or platform to show their work. And it's interesting because they say they want to feel like they're at a stage where it's professional. You know, they don't want to put stuff out that it's sort of, you know, it's sort of work in progress. Yeah. So they're editing before they. But I'm sort of thinking, well, you should just put stuff out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know? When I applied to St Martin's, you know, it was at that period where every tutor was advising, you should be on Twitter, you should be on Instagram, you should have your own blog. But I feel like now if a student said to you, I don't have it, but this is why, are you kind of almost think, oh, that's just as valid as...
Completely, and I'm interested what they're thinking, because obviously they're the ones that use this technology, you know, firsthand. So they're also digitally savvy, but they're making conscious decisions whether to put themselves or how to put themselves. They've all got Instagram, I know that.
Yeah.
So, but that's
check up on them.
I do check up on them and get very jealous about their lifestyle, their edited lifestyle. But it is so edited, you know, but it's quite interesting if students come for interviews, I do try and look at their Instagram account. Because you can just tell so much by someone's taste levels. Like that.
It's very true. If there's too many selfies,
get that's not good.
Okay, that's good to know. If you want to go to St Martin's, don't take selfies. That's the takeaway. One thing I do want to focus on just a little bit, I'm conscious of time, but I'm interested in this idea of dance and fashion, because it's not something I think we've ever talked about on a panel. I'm really intrigued by it. I think it's got a really rich history in fashion, and even just thinking, I'm a bit obsessed with Lee Barry, and I think it's really interesting. We talked about Club Kids, and Lee Barry's worked with Michael Clark, and I think there's such an amazing history, both within Gareth's kind of reference points, but also in fashion as a whole. Do we like fashion combined with dance?
I do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I just think it's very difficult. I think it's just a very difficult thing to do, isn't it? Because obviously
it can be terrible.
It's about movement, and obviously the clothes have to allow that movement, or it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
But I remember when McQueen did that show, and I can't remember which one it was.
Was it They Shoot Horses, don't they?
And that was just amazing. Yeah, beautiful. But it obviously has to work for the concept of the show. It shouldn't just be a case of doing dance because we've got some, some great dancers.
But I do think that dance provides an element of test driving a garment that a catwalk show doesn't. You never see a model sit down, hail a cab, run in those shoes. You know. And to see clothes put through their paces for movement is, you know, an enjoyable element of it. And I think that was one of the things that Body Map did brilliantly with Michael Clark, because they had all this soft sort of lycra bodycon stuff, which was very layered. It wasn't like the sort of body condom that seems to be so ubiquitous in mainstream clothing, but there was lots of layers, lots of movement, these amazing prints, and they were so suited to the dance and the movement.
Yeah, it's interesting this idea of test driving a garment. You're right. I've got visions in my head now of catwalk shows of girls having to, like, you know, almost like a triathlon. They have to run one bit and then they have to hail a cab. It's like proper test driving. No, but I think there's something wonderful. It makes clothes seem alive, and I think that's something we've got used to not seeing.
That's ridiculous.
Why?
Do a hurdle.
Yeah, exactly. Do a hurdle, hail a cab, jump over this. But you look at this and it feels that the clothes feel alive, don't they? And I think we've got so used to that flat image and looking at clothes almost as an image and not as something that's worn. And I think it's quite, and that's exacerbated with how people wear their clothes now. You know, they're so used to buying things to share online. I think there's a flatness to clothes now, which is quite interesting. But quite terrifying at the same time, this idea that, you know, it's not something that you have to interact with your body, it's just something that has to look great on a screen. Yeah. And that's fueled by street style as much as it is by catwalk, so it's quite an interesting thing.
But I think it depends on the designers as well. I mean, there are just a certain amount of designers that they can put these together and do it with the right way. I don't think that everyone can do this, you know, and look like that good. I mean, there are very, very specific designers that have like a very specific aesthetic in their minds, that the references are coming from all these kind of environments, and you see that, and they have to be, if I can say that, they have to be in kind of like a mature stage in their work, to be able to have this confidence of like putting something like this together. Otherwise, you know, this can go very, very wrong. You know, like,
I think that's a really smart point.
This can look like very badly because, especially on the level as well of the designer, you know, if someone is a very young designer, normally the clothes are not that perfectly made when they go down to the catwalk show. So imagine if someone had like to start moving on these clothes, they could like it could become like a disaster. Yeah. So there are lots of elements, but I think that designer has to be like in a certain level, and also very specific designers, for me at least, you know, think that they can do this.
That's so important to say, and I think it's really a credit to kind of how special Gareth is as a designer, that he can do this so seamlessly, and none of us kind of looking at it and thinking that it's gimmicky or that it's like just kind of pressed fodder, because it feels so innate to him.
That's very, very difficult. I mean, with all this movement, because it's not just that they're coming out and they do like just a small trick. I mean, I see them here like holding each other and in the air and everything. I mean, all these clothes have to be produced so perfectly. They have probably rehearsed that so many times to make sure that nothing is falling, nothing's breaking, you know, everything is going correct. The dancers can move in these clothes. These are normally productions that you see on theaters, on ballet, on in operas, and these taking about a year to be made and to make sure that the final result is as perfect as it looks like.
No,
I don't know if people have like this, I mean, designers in general have like this money, or, you know, like this time and means to produce something in such high level.
And also, like you said, practically, obviously, you know, things would have to be made so much earlier because they'd have to be, you know, tested and tried and, you know, rehearsed.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point, actually. You're used to people sewing almost as the garment leaves backstage, aren't you? So yeah, it's a real credit to Gareth's work, actually, isn't it? There's something quite brilliant about it, where you look at it and you think that he can do something so exciting and so dynamic and so immersive and pull it off with such confidence. You know, it's hard, I think it's hard enough to put on a catwalk show, and it's hard enough to make a collection. So to make a collection and also have enough vision and ideas to do something like this, it's brilliant. Are we happy to kick off New York, but also fashion season with something like this? Has it warmed us all, got us all excited about fashion?
Yeah, I think it's really exciting. Yeah, I just really want to see what is going to be put out officially, so we can actually see how. Because I think we've got a sense of how it works, or the timing, or the music. Obviously, is going to be so important.
But that's good, isn't it? It's left us wanting more.
Yeah, you want to see more.
I think that's really rare, actually, that you look at a catwalk show and you want to see more. So yeah. Thank you, gang. That's made me very excited. I'm going to finish my giant macaroon now. Thanks, Gareth. Should we give him a clap, because it's quite fabulous?